A warm welcome and thank you for attending this conference presentation entitled Imaginations, Newspapers, Identity, and the Irish Free Trade Crisis of 1779. My name is Joel Herman, and I am a Provost Project Award PhD researcher at Trinity College, Dublin, and I am currently researching the revolutionary currents that flowed between Ireland, America, and Britain in the Age of Revolutions in the late 18th century. Before getting started, I wanted to extend my thanks to the British Association for Irish Studies for facilitating and hosting this virtual conference. It is great to be able to engage with a scholarly community in those ways that technology still allows in this new age. And to begin, I wanted to direct your attention to a painting that will provide a window into the topic that I plan to talk about today. Francis Wheatley's painting of the Dublin Volunteers on College Green on the 4th of November, 1779 is an enduring piece of 18th century Irish art. The painter's depiction captures the organized and uniform force of the volunteers in blue gathered around King William's statue in the foreground, having just discharged their rifles in salute. This iteration of the Irish Volunteers had arisen in 1778, a voluntary military association formed to protect against the possibility of a French invasion, as the French had recently entered the American Revolutionary War in 1778 on the side of the American colonists. You can also see a contingent of the red-coated British cavalry. These would have been part of the British military establishment garrison in Dublin, as well as the civilian spectators watching on from the left. In the background, you may recognize the familiar facade of Trinity College, though the dome behind is long gone. You may also notice the pillars of the old Parliament building, now the Bank of Ireland, but the artist omits a significant element that obscures the historical meaning of the event and leaves the modern observer to wonder if this was anything more than a military parade in honor of the anniversary of King William's birthday. Curiously absent from the painting are a set of placards used by the volunteers to decorate all four sides of William's statue. The placards facing north, south, east, and west were punctuated with the statement, "A free trade or else." In this talk, the meaning of the volunteer statement and the factors that motivated them to make it will be explored at greater depth, offering a nuanced description of Dublin's free trade protest. This will help to reframe the November 1779 protest as more than just a decisive moment leading up to the Anglo-Irish political victory of legislative independence in 1782, and rather as the principal reason for that eventual outcome. With these objectives in mind, we'll begin by honing in on the newspaper's reporting of the free trade movement in 1779 up to the 4th of November, a movement that would grow over the course of that year. Through this narrative, we will chart the newspaper's construction of an imagined Irish patriot nation and its representation of a more inclusive Irish national identity in the public sphere. This using Benedict Anderson's helpful theoretical framework of the imagined community, which posits the print, and particularly the newspaper, can offer a powerful sense of belonging and identification as it allows individuals to participate in the nation that is being collectively imagined through the simultaneous consumption of the news at regular intervals, whether this be through reading or listening. In the second part of the talk, I will then trace the intersection of the newspaper's representation of this imagined Irish nation with the associational display of Dublin's free trade protest in a case study of the events of the 4th of November, this building on the work of Patrick Higgins and David Waldstreicher in an American context. The view being that print culture and ritual event can combine to act as a means to not only imagine the nation, but to bring it into being. Moving to the first part of the talk, we hone in on the role of the newspaper in reporting the free trade movement. This account is based primarily on the reporting of the three linchpins of the Patriot Press, the Freeman's Journal, the Hibernian Journal, and the Dublin Evening Post. These newspapers represent the three main blocks of Patriot opinion as their editors issued from the three major religio-ethnic communities in Ireland at the time, the Catholic, Anglican, and Presbyterian communities. In the early months of 1779, newspaper headlines were dominated by the trial of the British Admiral Keppel, accused of the mismanagement of British naval forces and engagement of the French fleet the admiral would develop into an opposition figure, and his exoneration would be cause for patriot celebration. But as this popular sensation drew to a close, the newspaper would turn to the simmering subject of free trade. At the root of this issue was a trade embargo imposed on Ireland by the British in 1776. David Dixon has described the reasons for this embargo, and I quote, "To ensure that the strategic larder for war, Ireland, remained capable of supplying the requirements of the British Army and Navy contractors." Here, a notice appearing in the Patriot newspaper, the Freeman's Journal, in March 1779 is helpful in illustrating the fermenting nature of the Irish and British relations and the growing agitation and popular reaction to the limitation of Irish trade. And this was heightened by the economic downturn of 1778, 1779. I have this on the screen for you. It reads, "The following paragraphs taken verbatim from a London paper furnish a striking proof of the illiberal, narrow-minded, and selfish spirit which actuates the generality of our English neighbors, and which we may principally attribute the present decay of trade, the piercing cry of our manufacturers, and all the consequent miseries of our bleeding country." The sentiment expressed isn't new, but the nature of the expression is significant, and it's important to note the attribution of all consequent miseries to the present decay of trade, as this exaggerated assessment of the economic situation would claim dominance in the public sphere. The language of free trade would allow those typically located outside of the political nation to participate and imagine themselves as part of the free trade movement, which wasn't based on constitutional and political right as in past conflicts, but instead on the wider platform of economic right. In this way, free trade would blur the traditional confessional fault lines of the Patriot press and infect the newspaper with an altered quality of inclusivity, acting as an ideological lever for the politicization of a broader popular front, as what had been a steady stream of trade-related news would evolve into a transcendent call for free trade. But before this movement could gain momentum, another force would need to exert itself and become a rallying cry of the public. This force of association, when united with the publicity of print, would spill forth and populate the pages of the newspaper. And in April, the Patriot Press would begin an associational campaign that would alter and transform the face of the Irish political landscape. On the 10th of April, the Dublin Evening Post would carry a letter calling for the newly formed Grand Jury of Dublin to follow the examples of Cork, Mayo, Galway, and Wicklow in effecting resolutions for non-importation association. These associations against the importation of British goods would quickly spread and be fastened upon by the Dublin newspaper as the only means of relief for our people. Soon thereafter, the newspaper would connect these popular associational movements with the rapid formation of volunteer companies throughout Ireland. The volunteers' march into print in May and June is striking, as the threat of an impending French invasion would have near endless mileage. But in August, their connection with the free trade movement would solidify. Resolutions made at the Dublin courts in Kilmainham would be reprinted in Dublin newspapers. Resolutions that included a proclamation for non-importation as well as a strategic plan for the formation of volunteer companies in the county of Dublin, thus combining these two rivers of associational practice into one. A letter appearing in the Freeman's Journal in August concerning the conduct of the Irish Parliament leads us to the final element in the construction of this imagined Irish nation, the Irish House of Commons. The anonymous author railed against the degeneracy of the Irish Parliament in an attempt to compel parliamentary representatives to express the desires of the public for a just and free trade. The author would be joined by other voices until on the 23rd of September, a notice in the newspaper to answer with an affirmative response, promising that Parliament would speak courageously for the people of Ireland in an address to the King. And so on the cusp of the date of Parliament's sitting, which had been prorogued until the 12th of October, an author writing in the name of the Catholic hero Owen Roe Nile would summon a vision of the Irish nation declaring, "If ever there was a moment of time big with the fate of any nation, the present is that moment to Ireland." This invocation of a Catholic hero, the appearance of other Catholic pen names, including Patrick Sarsfield, depictions of the Irish nation as the caricature Paddy, as opposed to the British John Bull, and the newspaper's increasingly explicit call for the disenfranchised Catholic population to join in the agitation for free trade can be taken as representative of the introduction of a more inclusive Irish national identity in the public sphere. Indeed, the Hibernian Journal would go so far as to claim that it is not now the cause of religion, it is the Irishmen of every denomination against the injustice of England. This tone of inclusiveness should of course be greeted with a healthy degree of skepticism, but should not be dismissed as the praise of patriot parliamentarians in Irish Gaelic verse warrants the contention that there was a tentative level of Catholic identification with the imagined Irish nation being constructed in the movement for free trade. On the 12th of October, news of the Irish House of Commons and those same patriot parliamentarians would appear in the pages of the newspaper. And in the first session of Parliament, patriot MPs would raise their voices in support of an amendment of the proposed address to the King, raising the issue of free trade. The amendment's victory would echo arguments that had been appearing in the Irish newspaper since the beginning of the year. The appearance of the amendment in the pages of the newspaper on the 19th of October would prove a symbolic victory for developing patriot majority. The introduction of a parliamentary voice to the emerging and evolving body of popular association would act to erect the final corporeal elements of the ideological construction of a cohesive national representation of the movement for free trade. The publicizing of the parliamentary debate would add to and consolidate an already clear articulation of Irish right. This voice would animate the body to movement and intersect with physical reality by bringing the abstract representation to bear in the material arena of the street. The procession and demonstration of the volunteers on the 4th November in protest for free trade and the reported approval of the Dublin crowd is illustrative of the definitive emergence of, and coalition of ritual and print acting together as mediums for participation in an invented Irish nation represented in the pages of the Irish newspaper and the wider culture of print. This spectacle conclusively legitimates the role and power of the newspaper in developing, articulating, and representing an imagined Irish patriot nation united in the movement for free trade. As we move to the second part of the talk, our narrative slows from months to the hours of a single day, the 4th of November. This spectacle, the annual public celebration of William III's birthday, will be illuminated through an exhaustive reading of extant Dublin newspapers, as well as other regional newspapers. The consistency of at least 10 separate accounts, fashioned together to describe the event, will demonstrate how the radical patriot press had co-opted public discourse in reaction to contemporary events and brought an inclusive vision of an Irish nation to bear in Dublin's public sphere. On the morning of the 4th of November, the city would wake pregnant with expectation for a display that the newspaper had been anticipating. The united core of our volunteer would assemble in Stephen's Green and march with drums beating and colors flying in files through York Street, Unger Street, Bishop Street, Bride Street, Warburg Street, Castle Street, Cork Hill, and down Dame Street till they arrived at College Green, where they arranged themselves round the statue of King William. By 12:30, being assembled in College Green in their different companies, the volunteers had already displaced the Lord Lieutenant and castle administration and rewritten years of convention and tradition. Aside from the official government mouthpiece, the Dublin Gazette, every Dublin newspaper would scrutinize the marching volunteers from the color and style of their uniforms to their commanding officer and the type and size of their force. But the volunteers were not the only object of the paper's fascination, and indeed not the only participants in the ritual theater of the street. The newspaper would speak extravagantly of the crowds that line the avenues of Dublin. One newspaper would even note that the boulevard that leads into College Green was so crowded that freedom of movement was impossible until the whole event was concluded. As the masses of Dublin surrounded the square of College Green, all eyes were drawn to the Duke, on whose command the whole being upward of 1,200 men would fire 3 grand discharges. Only then would they separate and reveal William's statue, which was most elegantly adorned, as the shields of the 4 sides of the pedestal were hung the following labels in large capital letters: West, the glorious revolution; East, the volunteers of Ireland; South, relief to Ireland; North, a short money bill, a free trade or else. A protest, a statement, a threat of force, or even revolution, one newspaper would declare that the words spoke the most intelligible language. This language and the demonstration itself were clearly understood as one London newspaper would respond. They insist upon his granting what no Irish parliament had ever the presumption to ask, so that the Parliament of England in the reign of Charles I, at the very time they were in open arms against the king and daily lessening his power and influence, in all their addresses to him professed the highest loyalty and most profound regard for his sacred person. This paper's elicitation of another Irish rebellion is proof that the message had been received across the Irish Sea, and the words of threat decorating each side of William's statue in the center of College Green, that symbolic political space, were reverberating outwards through the construction of an associational display that would be amplified by the publicity of the Irish newspaper. The repeated huzzas given by the surrounding multitude would render the Lord Lieutenant a mere afterthought in the leading patriot papers, though he would be afforded more space in the government-friendly Faulkner's Dublin Journal, but even there he was eclipsed by the action of the volunteers. This fact should not be passed over, as it is confirmation of the victory of an imagined Irish patriot nation over the alternative British imperial narrative offered by the Castle administration. The support of the Catholic populace is further proof that the event of William's birthday, an iconic day in the Dublin Protestant calendar, had been successfully appropriated in the name of this imagination, as the Freeman's Journal report that all distinction of religion and prejudice were suspended. This support is perhaps more convincingly represented in the crowd's reported jeering of British troops as opposed to its support for the volunteers, a crowd that by that time would have held a significant Catholic contingent. The newspaper is aware of the great changes that had occurred in the celebration of this annual commemorative event is compelling. The accustomed annual procession around the statue of King William III by mercenaries was changed. A body of 1,000 citizens, men of various professions, ranks, and fortunes, appeared under arms, perfectly disciplined and appointed in all respects. As they marched around William's statue and through the streets, accompanied by the adulation and voice of the crowds of Dublin, representation met representative in ideological and material parity, and for a moment a nation inhabited the capital on that day. This body of men, which was Protestant in composition, led by the patriot members of Parliament, would enjoy the support of every group, faction, and religion in the city of Dublin under the banner of free trade and Irish economic interest. In essence, a mass reordering of public and popular identity had been in effect over the course of 1779. The newspaper's publicizing of the free trade movement had given birth to this new expression of Irish national identity. A mere representation of an imagined Irish patriot nation had manifested itself in the cultural appropriation of the most significant ritually British event of the year. Of course, this mass reorganization of individual identity was not always permanent, as old loyalties and latent identities would return, but admitting the temporary nature of the alliance and the regional scale of this study does not diminish the fact that the movement for free trade and the reimagination of Irish identity it had required had expanded the umbrella of an imagined Irish nation, so that groups previously defined in their opposition to one another could form a tenuous alliance united by a common enemy. On the 4th of November, a series of transformations had occurred, transformations that may not have been permanent or absolute, but are powerful reminders nonetheless that through the coalescence of the mediums of print and ritual event, individuals, groups, and communities can not only participate in an imagination, but bring one into being. In one day, a Protestant event of commemoration had been transformed into a patriotically Irish protest. A Protestant police force had become an Irish militia. The voice of a Catholic crowd had united with the Anglo-Irish political nation on a day remembering the birthday of their most hated foe, and a statue of a British king had been decorated with the words, "A free trade or else." In conclusion, the year of 1779 should be acknowledged as the crucible by which contesting ideologies of a nation could be formed, fashioned, and fused together by the compacting and unifying force of a keenly perceived and felt tyranny, an imperial tyranny brought more powerfully into being through transnational revolutionary currents and made manifest in the creation an assumption of an oppositional identity crafted and idealized in print, particularly in the newspaper, and fully realized in the materialization of that representation in the ritual theater of the street on the 4th of November, 1779. The residual impact of this national moment would linger even as the wider economic platform on which it was based splintered gradually into a movement for Anglo-Irish parliamentary right, but not before the concessions wrested from the British Parliament would be used by the radical press to solidify the victory of an Irish national identity over the British other, and in the words of the Hibernian Chronicle, in pity to a vanquished foe, drop a tear over her weakness. Thanks very much for listening.